Welcome to Twin Talk Politics.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Twin Talk Politics. And today, we are so honored to be joined by Professor Ian Shapiro, Sterling Professor of Political Science and Global Affairs at Yale University. And he is one of the world's leading scholars of democracy, renowned for his influential writing and for shaping global conversations on justice, the economy, and political insecurity. And actually, a fun fact, even before speaking with him today, we've been long students of Professor Shapiro's work from afar, having watched many of his Devane lectures. So truly an honor to have you on today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. We actually have a tradition on our podcast where the first question for all of our guests is actually a question of dumb luck. So if it's not evident by our similar looks or the podcast name, Twin Talk Politics, we're actually twins. So we were wondering if you could take that 50-50 blind guess at who do you think is Jason and who do you think is Jerry, just based on our different colored backgrounds.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
All right. I'm Jason, the one in the orange background, and that's Jerry in the blue background. The more handsome one is Jerry. To the future. I'm slightly chubbier, so that's the way you can tell us apart. Great. Now that you do know how to tell us apart, let's just jump straight into the interview. Now, obviously, Jerry and I are very familiar with all the incredible things you've done, but for the listeners at home who might not be as familiar, we were just wondering if you could give us a quick introduction and maybe how you got interested in political science in the first place.
Sure. I've always been interested in politics. I grew up at the height of apartheid in South Africa, which more or less impinges, politics impinges on every aspect of your life when you're living in a society like that. And I moved to the UK when I was quite young because I didn't want to go to the apartheid military and be involved in enforcing apartheid in the black townships in South Africa. And so I've just always been interested in politics from the beginning. And then I was an undergraduate there, and then I came to the US and did a PhD in political science, and I went to law school here as well. And just have always been fascinated by trying to understand what makes the political world work.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. It's really inspiring. So our first question, just to start things off, we want you to dive into one of the more central themes of your work, which is this idea of domination, which you identify as the primary purpose of politics to confront. And in your books, Politics Against Domination, I have it right here. I know it might be a bit hard to see, but you define it as the avoidable and illegitimate exercise of power that compromises people's basic interests. In other words, meaning power that people cannot reasonably resist or hold accountable. And one idea that really stood out to us when reading it was your argument that two concepts that usual people like us often associate with each other, which is the idea of justice and democracy, according to you, often clash, but can often only succeed if pursued together because both depend on reducing domination. So our question is, we were wondering if you could please explain in a little bit more detail, how do you see the relationship between them playing out in the real world?
So I think that if you look at how modern democracies came onto the agenda in the West, as distinct from how philosophers often talk about the creation of democracy. People often talk about the creation of democracy as a decision by people to delegate power to a government. What are the conditions under which they do that, and then how do they make the government remain accountable to them? And it's a sort of principal-agent relationship, the people being the principals and the government being the agent. I don't think that has much to do with how modern democracies emerged. I think that the Western world didn't go from feudalism to democracy. It went from feudalism to absolutism.
Mm.
to democracy, and the famous book about this is Perry Anderson's book, Lineages of the Absolutist State. But basically, um, feudal feudal societies were pretty decentralized, and you had these different barons who had their own fiefdoms, and the partly for reasons of technology, partly for reasons of the economy, the kings and queens of Europe began centralizing power, seizing lands from feudal lords or from the church, and creating something more like what we would recognize as a modern state. Weber defines a state as a monopoly of the legitimate use of coercive force. And these states were then suddenly in a position to exert huge amounts of power and control over people that hadn't been there before. These absolutist states had a new kind of coercive power that hadn't existed before, and they started to use it, and people reacted against that. And they suddenly found they were vulnerable to exercise of domination they hadn't been vulnerable to before. And so you started to get demands for parliaments, you started to get demands for limitations on the sovereign. And I think that so it was resisting domination that led people to complain both about injustice and about having decisions imposed on them. And I think that most people who experience injustice often demand democratic accountability. So I think, unlike the academic literature, where these things are all reasoned about in the abstract and tend to be seen as um, going on in different philosophical domains, I think the resistance to injustice and the demand for democratic accountability went hand in hand historically. And I think we can do better theorizing if we take that history seriously.
For sure. And just building on top of that, we wanted to turn to democracy itself in a little bit more detail.
Mhm.
In your works, you defend it from, a mature Enlightenment standpoint, often grounded in reason and freedom through representative institutions, rather, as you said, rather than abstract or utopian visions. We know you've also described democracy as a conditioning good. So not just valuable in of itself, but valuable because it shapes the way that interactions take place without dictating outcomes, making it harder for power, for instance, to be imposed upon people without consent or accountability. So our question is, at a time where democracy itself is in peril all over the world, where reports show that autocracies now outnumber democracies worldwide for the first time in, I believe, 20 years, how does this understanding of democracy better shape the way that we should think about protecting democracy today?
Okay, so that is gets to a complexity in my work that's worth just making clear. I think that it's important to democratize power relations wherever they occur. And, we've known we in the modern world from reading Foucault, but in the ancient world from reading Plato, that power relations are ubiquitous to human interaction. They occur everywhere. They occur in the classroom, they occur in the workplace, they occur in the family, um, and they occur in public institutions. But what I actually argue, I've written two books about justice. One was called Democratic Justice, and the other is Power and Against Domination. And it's in civil institutions where there's some other purpose than the exercise of power to the enterprise. So in the workplace, you're trying to produce goods and services. In the educational institution, you're trying to produce enlightened people. That when I talk about democracy as a conditioning good, I mean uh, it should play a role in civil institutions, but not to the point where it obliterates the superordinate good. So if you had a democratically run firm that was had so much emphasis on democratic process that it couldn't produce goods and services effectively, that would be self-defeating.
Mhm.
When we talk about public institutions, there is no superordinate good. So it's about power all the way down. Um, and I don't think, therefore, the democracy is a subordinate good. So I think when we're talking about the exercise of power by through public institutions, there is no other good. So it's not a subordinate good.
Yeah, just touching up on the conversation there, with the global rise of authoritarianism,
Yeah.
democracy promotion remains a powerful moral imperative, and liberal democracies have often seen themselves as its champions. Yet, as you've stated, and as history has shown, that external efforts to impose democracies can actually fuel instability, erode legitimacy, and even strengthen authoritarian backlash over long periods of time. So, where our question is, how can liberal democracies navigate this tension today, upholding their commitment to democratic values while also respecting local context and national sovereignty?
So um, you're talking now about liberal democracies preserving democracy in their own countries or promoting democracy elsewhere.
Promoting democracy elsewhere.
So what are the conditions necessary for promoting democracy elsewhere? It's almost never the case that it can be done by force. The only two counterexamples in history are West Germany and Japan after World War II.
Mhm.
And that was there were a variety of very unusual factors associated with that. First of all, they had both had pre-World War II histories of democracy. Secondly, the war, the Second World War for both those countries had the feature that by the end of it, the vast majority of the populations of those countries blamed their own authoritarian leaders for
Right.
taking them into the wars that
Yeah.
led to their catastrophic defeat. So it was unlike, say, Germany after World War One, where there were large numbers of Germans after World War One who believed that they had been they had been betrayed by their own leaders and they should never have signed the armistice and so on. But the calamities that befell those two countries in Second World War, at the end of the war, the vast majority of the populations really believed that the reason for their defeat was their own authoritarian leadership. That was you know um, the militarists in Japan and the Nazi regime in Germany. So, so the imposing powers, the victorious allies, had a kind of legitimacy that is almost never there. And I don't know of any other case where
Yeah.
that has been true. Thirdly, in both cases, the Western powers remained hovering for decades. And that was hugely important for, they invested in rebuilding through the Marshall Plan in Germany and investing in the Japanese economy, in rebuilding those economies as widely diversified economies, which is important for the survival of democracy, for reasons I'll talk about more in a minute. But um, so they made these huge investments. They folded them into emerging international relationships through trade agreements and security agreements. And so the victorious powers invested a huge amount in creating the post-war democracies and then making sure that they would survive, basically hovering it there for decades and including them in the new post-war trade and security arrangements. If you look at the other attempts to impose democracy, say after the Cold War, none of those things was present.
Yeah.
So, if you look at, say, Afghanistan or Iraq, uh, you know, none of those things was present. There was no
Yeah.
pre-war history. There was no sense that the invading power was behaving legitimately on the part of the population. So the governments that were set up in, the Karzai government in Kabul, or the various governments that were set up in Iraq, they were perceived as American puppets. They never
Yeah.
had legitimacy. Um, and then they didn't invest any significant resources in rebuilding those countries. Um, and they made no effort to create a diversified economy. And a diversified economy is hugely important for democracy because we in the political economy literature we talk about the oil curse.
Yeah.
And so there are reasons why the oil curse is bad for the economy, but it's also bad for democracy. And the reason it's bad for democracy is when you have an economy where there's basically only one principal source of wealth and income, the people who control access to it are not going to want to give up that access
Right.
without a fight if they lose an election, and anybody who can grab control of access to it is going to try. So, so if you have a situation where basically, in Afghanistan, it's not oil, but it was the poppy economy,
Yeah. Yeah.
and in Iraq it was oil. Um, People are not going to want to give up power, because the control of the government is pretty much the only way to become to make money and to be secure. And so what's really important for democracy is the stakes have to be lower. The costs of losing an election to the person who's in government have to be lower so that they'll go off and do things, right? And in these countries, that's not the case. And so, the Sunnis in Iraq are the minority.
Yeah.
Um, all access to the oil economy, access to the higher ranks of the military, access to um, access to status, access to everything, all goes along the Sunni Shiite divide. So the Sunnis know that in any democratic election they will lose, and so they're going to reach for their guns, and that's exactly what
Wow.
happens. So unless you have a diversified economy and cross-cutting economic interests in the society, what Robert Dahl called a pluralist society, it's not propitious for democracy to survive. And then there are other considerations. Democracy doesn't do well in very poor countries. The big exception is India, and I could talk about why it's exceptional if you want, but for the most part, um, democracy doesn't flourish in very poor countries. The countries as poor as Afghanistan or
Rock.
oil-first countries. The only countries in which you find democracy surviving, say in an oil economy, is if oil is discovered or after the economy is already diversified, such
Oh.
as
Oh, okay.
Norway or Scotland.
Yeah.
Then it can survive. But if it's whatever, Nigeria or Iraq or uh, Saudi Arabia. These are countries that it's almost impossible of all the things we look at that helps democracy survive that weren't present. And so that's a long preamble, but the short answer to your question is if Western countries want to promote democracy in the world, the way to do it is to invest in economic development of diversified economies in countries that don't have that.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much for drawing that nuanced distinction between Japan and Germany and Iran and Iraq. And yeah, that analysis of the Dutch disease is something new for both of us. So thank you so much for that. And that kind of ties in very nicely with your book and what we hope to talk about a little bit more now, which is The Wolf at the Door, the Menace of Economic Insecurity and How to Fight It. And we actually have two different and distinct questions here. First, on economic insecurity holistically, and then one on the multiple areas that you discussed, but specifically on healthcare. So first, on economic insecurity, we know you've argued that one of the greatest threats to American democracy, if not the biggest, is actually not inequality itself, but economic insecurity. And this is what we found really fascinating because people fear losing what they already had far more, exponentially more than what they aspire to gain. And it's uniquely this insecurity that has driven political polarization, resentment, and the rise of virulent populist politics. And especially in today's world with workers cycling between, I know you've delivered the statistic before, 12 to 14 jobs in their lifetime, and the collapse of private sector work unions, you've actually proposed strengthening wages and work support through expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC for short, to really boost low and moderate income wages directly. So our question for you is, why do you see the EITC as the most promising solution forward compared to alternatives such as raising the minimum wage, universal basic income, or increasing wealth taxation?
So, well, those are all very different alternatives from one another. I think that, when you're thinking, in that book, the Wolf at the Door book, the analytical architecture of that book is about coalitions.
Yeah.
And if you have to always think in politics, not just whether you think something is a good policy, but what is the coalition likely to be that will support it? And what are the coalitions likely to be that are going to emerge to block it? And how you're going to get from A to B, because having an idea for what you think would be a great policy, if there's not going to be a winning coalition to create it, it's going to be very difficult to, I mean, I don't think it's, for me, I'm interested in things that have some realistic chance of
Yeah.
actually, John Rawls once used the term realistic utopias,
Yeah.
right? I want to know, I don't want to be the guy that goes up to the farmer in Donegal and says, how do I get to Dublin? And he says, well, I wouldn't start from here, Sonny. Right. Yeah. So if you talk about the different things you've mentioned,
Yeah.
so an earned income tax credit has a number of features that are helpful, which things like well, like you mentioned, what did UBI? If you look at the efforts to institute UBIs, they are there's sometimes there's an appearance there's a big constituency for it. It's quite misleading.
Yeah.
Because the people on the right who support it support it instead of the existing welfare state, whereas the people on the left who support it in addition to the existing.
Yeah.
So there's actually not a coalition for anything. There's not a coalition for really a coalition for a UBI. And it's not, it's also labor unions are against them. If you look at where they've tried to do it in Europe, because of their effect on the labor market,
Hmm.
it's very difficult to see. And, especially with this book was about the US, there's
Yeah.
such strong opposition to paying people that doesn't have some connection to work that I think it's politically a complete non-starter.
Yeah.
Um, so, what were the other things you mentioned? And then we'll come back to the EITC. Minimum wage, did you
Minimum
say?
wage. Yeah.
Yeah. So minimum wage is I'm not against minimum wage,
Yeah.
but it also it's essentially an unfunded mandate on business
Yeah.
by the government, and it has also it courts with it the possibility of a race to the bottom problem.
All right. Yeah. Wow.
If California puts up their minimum wage, uh, firms are going to move to Florida, or if
Yeah.
the US puts it up, they're going to move to
Away.
Mexico.
Yeah. Okay.
Now that, reality is somewhat stickier than an economic model, but the basic dynamic is to drive capital away rather than to attract
Yeah.
capital.
Yeah.
Um, so, now there are circumstances where increasing the minimum wage makes sense. I mean, for example, I ran across when I was working on this, there was an effort to raise the minimum wage in Los Angeles, California. Called Chamber of Commerce got behind it, which is puzzling, right? Because you say, why would they? But so we did some interviewing, and what we discovered was that the local businesses believed that the higher wages would be spent in their businesses. So people would earn more, but they would also spend it in their in LA. So,
Hmm.
never say never, but I
Yeah.
think as a general matter, it's hard to see the coalition for it. It's easy to see the coalition against
Against.
it.
Yeah.
And it's got this kind of this race to the bottom problem. Now, if you think about the EITC, what's good about the EITC? First of all, it's easy to sell because it's connected to work. You have to work, you have to be employed to get it. That doesn't deal with the problem of the unemployed and this particularly the long-term unemployed, but you shouldn't object to a policy on the grounds that it doesn't solve every problem. The
Right.
question, can it solve some big problems? So that's one thing. Secondly, the EITC is a subsidy to business, but it's paid to the worker. So the business cannot actually get the benefit unless they hire the worker.
Wow.
Whereas if you give corporate tax cuts as a way to induce businesses to invest, as the Trump tax cuts in 2017 did, and now, the problem is with that is they can spend it on stock buybacks.
Hmm.
Then
Right.
they may not invest it in the workforce. And if you look at the empirical studies that have since been done of what happened with the 2017 corporate tax cuts, almost none of it trickled through to employment. And where it did, it mostly went to pay uh, high management salaries within the companies that
Wow.
got the. So it is a subsidy to business, but the only way the business can get the subsidies to actually hire the worker.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's a second feature of it. And then a third feature is that far from a race to the bottom, it has a logic of race to the top to it. Because if you are subsidizing employment in one economy or one part of the economy, that's going to make it a magnet for capital. So,
Wow. Right.
so a
Okay.
lot of the US, there are also state EITCs, so if Minnesota puts in an EITC and starts attracting firms from the surrounding states, they're going to have to do it too. So it's exact mirror image of a race to the bottom problem. And so, you know, I mean, economists will still object to it as they'll say it's distorting labor markets and so forth, but they'll object to any kind of any of these interventions.
Yeah.
I think if you look at, you know, what economists have written about the EITC, you find pretty broad support for it. I think for the reasons I'm saying, even, you know, conservative economists like Robert Barrow like the EITC, and liberal economists like Larry Summers like the EITC. And I think this is the reason, or the features of it that I've mentioned are among the reasons. And it's to me not surprising that this is the one, you know, it started with in the Nixon administration. He came up with it. It was actually not, it was Ford who finally implemented it for the first time. But it has been expanded by Democratic and Republican every Democratic and Republican administration until Trump expanded it. So so I think it's got, you know, good economic features, it's
Definitely.
got
Yeah.
good policy, and you can see, you know, a plausible political coalition to get it and to keep it. And so so that's how I, you know, in this book you brought up, the Wolf at the Door book, we're looking at these different types of interventions from the perspective of where how can you get a winning coalition to create it and then to stop the blocking coalitions from destroying it?
Sure. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. Yeah, that definitely moved us. Your arguments about like the trickle up effect, going like the funds going directly to the workers instead of the employers. And then on the idea of coalitions, we'll definitely be talking a lot more about coalitions in this question. So I think that perfectly segues into sort of the discussion we wanted to have with you around your proposals for healthcare reform. But before that, we live in Canada, which, as you know, has universal insurance but private provision. So healthcare is something that we're really grateful of and is definitely an aspect we're particularly interested in. But before getting into the question, we know that you said this a bit before, but we've been really appreciative of your problem-driven approach, bridging the usual divide that we see between policy and politics, but emphasizing solutions, as you said previously, that are both effective and then also politically feasible and realistic in our world. So first and foremost, we wanted to take a moment to thank you for that. Um, on the idea of healthcare inequality, then, obviously it's an enormous issue right now in the States with nearly 30 million Americans still uninsured and millions more underinsured or facing medical debt. And one of your proposals here is centered around this idea of the bottom-up expansion, starting with a public Medicare option for younger adults who are statistically less expensive to insure and likely going to keep it for a very long period of time, thereby, as you said, building a broader coalition for universal coverage. And our question here is, what safeguards do you see as necessary?
So the difficulty in the US is a different one. So, you know, we got Medicare and Medicaid in 1965 in the Johnson administration, a part of the Great Society. And so, you know, just for Canadians who may not know this, Medicaid is medical insurance for poor people, and there's a federal subsidy, and states top it up and administer it, and it's not a great system. It's lots of people get very bad medical treatment out of it, and we could come back to that if you want. But Medicare is universal health insurance for people over 65.
Yeah,
And it's good. It's high quality health insurance. And so you know, my sense of the history of this is that, you know, Lyndon Johnson became president in 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated. Um, and then he um, had an impressive legislative achievement in 64, and he passed the Civil Rights Act. and then he wins in a landslide in 64, the huge landslide, one of the biggest landslides in American history. And I think his expectation was that he would do the first big chunk of the Great Society in the rest of that term, and that he would get reelected in 68 and carry on because it was so popular and he had figured out the politics of putting together the coalitions for what he was doing. And what he didn't count on was the Vietnam War was going to destroy his presidency. So
Right.
so he was doing it in chunks. And so he started with Medicare, which is 65-year-old and over. Um, and most of the big elements of the Great Society were done in 65. And then the Vietnam War gets worse and worse and worse, and it gets less, more and more unpopular. And, by 67, it's clear that he's not going to be able to, it's clear he's not going to win. And then it's clear he can't even think about running. So the next part never happened. And so the problem was the mirror image of what you said, namely, you've got old people who have good universal health insurance. And from their point of view, if you now expanded it to everybody, their fear will be that the quality will go down.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
and they have one of the most powerful interest groups in American politics in the AARP. I mean, maybe equaled only by the gun lobby as a powerful interest group. They vote in very high numbers, they raise a lot of money, and they're big lobbyists in Washington. Um, and so the problem is that there isn't a good coalition so you've got that problem. Then the second problem is that you have most people get insurance through their employers. And most people historically have been reasonably satisfied with that insurance. And, this also has a kind of, it has a contingent history that hasn't come up anywhere else in the world. But basically what happened um, during World War II, they were worried about inflation because, you know, uh, there was a very tight labor market because so many people were fighting the war, and there was a lot of demand because the government was, trying to get lots of stuff produced, and so they put in wage and price controls. The government put in wage and price controls in World War II, and the only way firms could compete for labor was by offering benefits. And so they started offering health insurance, right? So it's a path dependent story that um, it's my colleague Jacob Hacker has one of his books is called The Privatized Welfare State, and where he goes into this history. But the takeaway point is that you don't have the coalition for universal health care because first of all, you have the old people who've already got it and they don't want it diluted. Secondly, you've got people who're getting it through employment who they think, I have this, I already have a good situation. I don't know what it's going to be like if we get rid of this. And so you've got not only do you not have the coalition for it, you've got the blocking coalitions to stop it. So that's the problem in America. And a third problem is when people talk about just going straight to universal health insurance,
Yeah.
the sticker shock uh, makes it radioactive. You have Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders talking about it, and they say it's going to cost $40 trillion. Even if, a lot of it is smoke and mirrors and they don't really know. The fact is, when proposals for it come up, um, they go nowhere. And even a lot of Democrats it's not just the Republicans who don't want it. And so our idea was, you've got to, again, you've got to start from where you are, right? And where we are is with this system, and this problem with the coalitions, absence of coalitions for it, and the presence of blocking coalitions. And so our argument was, let's let's start with the young people who are cheap to insure because they're
Yeah.
not sick. And so the idea was, so I think we said 26 to 35-year-olds can get it first. They can buy into it and the government can subsidize it. And, we can argue about the subsidies and they could change and so on and so forth. But then once they've got it, as you mentioned earlier, I'm very taken with the Kahneman and Tversky loss aversion arguments. Once people have got something, they don't want to give it up.
Yeah.
That's why people who've got health insurance, their employers don't want to give it up.
Mhm.
But so you let this young cohort come in and it's much cheaper. And a lot of them don't even really think they need health insurance because there's nothing wrong with them, which is a fallacy. That's exactly you don't wait until your house is on fire to buy health,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But so you give it to them, and then they won't want to lose it because they've got it. And then you can think about the people with private health insurance who are losing it because, as you said, people are losing lifetime employment and they're losing. So that there are people who had private health insurance that are losing it, or the employers are buying cheaper plans because the cost of health insurance is so high in the US,
Yeah.
because it's a very inefficient system. So there are these people who are falling out of the existing system, and you let them buy in. And so this is the idea of coalition building, that you are creating, you're both dealing with the fact that there's no coalition for it, and that there are these coalitions against it by starting somewhere where it's feasible. But then you're going to be building the coalition for it as you go. And you don't even have to add higher. I mean, if you can, in after 3 years, add people for another 6 or 7 years. But even if you fail, the people you gave it to are going to start getting older, right? So they're going to keep it.
Oh,
So
okay.
in the natural course of
Right.
things, eventually you will get there.
Mhm.
Uh, but again, you've got to, if you're serious about addressing this in the US, because it is, sui generis. This history makes it sui generis. You have to think in that kind of way about the problem. Otherwise, you're just shouting at the wind.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I guess that brings us from the challenges of expanding healthcare coverage to another major strain on democracy today, which is the rapid rise of political polarization. With nearly 9 in 10 Americans recognizing it as a major problem, you've noted that it actually shifts power away from the broader electorate and into the hands of the grassroots and the more extreme versions. And specifically in a context of a two-party system, much of this polarization stems from the dynamic of safe seats and primaries. And since general elections in safe districts are rarely competitive, primaries then become very decisive. Yet instead of being decided by the very median voter of both parties, they're dominated by voters from the ideological fringes of both the left and right. And we were particularly struck by an example that you used in a previous lecture of yours, which was in 2016 when President Donald Trump won the Republican nomination with support from only about, I'm not sure if it was exactly 5 or 6% of the entire electorate. Thus, regardless of whichever party wins, candidates risk being far more extreme, far more left, or far more right than the mainstream of their party. Reforms like open primaries and ranked choice voting as ways to address this dynamic. So we're just wondering, could you expand on how these might help reduce the overall polarization?
No, I don't think they help, those particular reforms. I think that the real problem is not primaries. It's, as you just intimated, it's the combination of primaries and safe seats,
Yeah.
right? Because America's had primaries for 120 years. Um, but what's changed is the number of safe seats has been increasing and increasing and increasing. And that's happened for a variety of reasons. Some of it is just natural demographic sorting, some of it's urbanization, so you get blue cities in red states and so on. Some of it is gerrymandering, which you're seeing a lot going on right
Right now,
now.
yeah.
Um, some of it is, byproduct of completely different reforms, like the pressure to create majority minority districts to get more minority representation, which starts in the 1980s and is successful at that, but it also creates more safe seats because most majority African American districts are also Democratic, and so you're creating a seat where there's a majority of the minority, but also you're creating a safe Democratic seat there surrounded by safe Republican seats, which is why the Reagan Justice Department got behind the majority minority districts movement. So that, about a fifth of the seats in Congress now are majority minority districts. So all of these different factors have produced this world in which the vast majority of seats in Congress now are safe seats.
Yeah.
And you get something comparable in the Senate, not through redistricting, but because of the overrepresentation of very small states, because every state gets, Wyoming gets two senators and California gets two senators. Wyoming only gets one congressman. So that, there's 7 states that only qualify for one congressional representative but get two senators. So it's, and those happen also to be predominantly rural, um, uh, conservatives, very safe conservatives. So it's a different dynamic in the Senate, but it produces the same result. And so people talk about ranked choice voting and open primaries, speculating that it's going to help the election of more moderate centrist candidates.
Yeah.
The evidence on that is very weak, very mixed.
Okay.
Uh, But it has the added demerit of weakening parties because it keeps small parties alive. So I actually think the better solution is redistricting,
Okay.
uh, and redistricting to get competitive districts. And that, I mean, it's not the best thing to advocate this week, because of what's just happening in Texas and
Yeah.
California. But just to take a step back from this immediate politics, um, in fact, I think it's 22 or 23 of the states now have independent commissions, and they have a variety of criteria, but and most of them don't have the mandate to draw competitive districts between the parties, which is what really is needed, so that you don't get away from the safe seats. But they could have, and I think what's going on now is going to breed backlash. Um, and in actually in 2021, the Democrats had a proposal for national redistricting, which I think will come back. The Democrats they need to have their Project 2029, like Republican Project 2025. Um, and this would be a part of it, I think that, and it has the added advantage that for most political reforms, people tend to think, well, the problem is that the current incumbents are beneficiaries of the existing system, so they're going to stonewall it to death. But in this particular case, the current incumbents actually hate this system because, first of all, it forces them to raise money all the time. And
Gotcha.
second, is it's so expensive to run in these, retail politics is much more expensive than wholesale politics. Everybody's got to run their own race. And everybody's afraid of somebody coming in and spending a lot of money in the primary against them. but they also hate it because they can't govern. Because the whole structure of the American system is it's very difficult to govern unilaterally with one party in the way you can in Britain, let's say.
Mhm.
And if the parties are being pulled so far apart by polarization that they can't agree on anything, there's going to be, mostly what they're going to do in Washington is, investigations and position taking, and it's going to be very difficult for them to govern. So they don't like it, actually. I mean, there's a kind of prisoner's dilemma. They they would all be better off getting away from this system, but the problem is getting from here to there. Um, uh, so so I think that that would be a much better solution and a much better. It's more likely to have an impact on the problem. And even though, as I said, in the immediate political moment, um, the the wind is blowing the other way. I think there's almost certainly going to be backlash against this because it's going to make the country even more ungovernable. I could be wrong, but that's what if I had to bet on a reform that's more likely to get somewhere with this problem, that's what I would bet on.
Thank you for that. And for the last part of the interview, we wanted just to talk a bit more about some of the ideas you mentioned that relates to your book, Responsible Parties. And in it, you argue that strong programmatic parties are essential for accountability. Yet many voters today often seem to have obviously some disillusionment towards the government and seem to distrust parties and gravitate much more towards more, I guess, like individualized, personality-driven politics. So, in an era where political branding often overshadows party platforms, how can parties rebuild legitimacy and reconnect with voters?
So that's a big question.
Yeah,
Answer is different in two-party systems and in multi-party systems.
yeah,
And you know the the big fallacy to avoid is that the grass is greener. So there are many people in America who say the problem is a two-party system. We really need to go to PR and have lots of parties. I was just involved in a symposium about that in the Boston Review not so long ago. Um, but people who think the grass is greener, you should go and look. Bagehot once said the cure for being impressed by the House of Lords is to go and look at it. So the people who don't like the two-party system um, and think we should have a multi-party system should go and look at what's happening in the multi-party systems in the world today. Because whereas in the two-party system, we've seen a weakening of parties. So America has very weak parties because of the reasons we've been talked about. They're controlled by their flanks, the activists on the fringes,
yeah.
and the leadership can't govern because they will be primaried to death. Um, in the multi-party systems, the problem is fragmentation. We're getting more and more and more parties, and the old look at what's happening. It's France this week, but it was Germany in March, and all of these countries voters have become disenchanted with the old mainstream parties
Right.
and mobilizable by populists, whether through the primary system in the US or through Alternative for Deutschland or in Germany or National Rally in France. And I think the problem there, it comes back to economic insecurity. And for 4 decades, the mainstream parties have not addressed economic insecurity as it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And I think the reason for that has been the triumph of neoliberal policies that, at the end of the 70s, Keynesianism was on the defensive because it looked like it hadn't dealt with the stagflation of the 70s. And the neoliberals who had been hanging around in think tanks for decades suddenly got their opening. People like Thatcher and Reagan gave them their opening. They kind of mainstreamed that.
Mhm.
And the center left parties were, as I said, they were on the defensive about Keynesian policies. So they started, I use the word triangulating towards the middle because they wanted to get elected and they thought they have to show that they can also be neoliberals. And then that goes into overdrive after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so you've got decades and decades of both the center left parties and the center right parties getting behind a growth model that doesn't benefit the vast majority of people. All of the benefits go to the top. And so you have, 40 years of wage stagnation at the bottom of the 90%. And not only is it wage stagnation, family incomes are only protected by going from a one earner to a two earner family. The people are becoming more and more insecure because lifetime employment has gone away. And it's those people who have become disenchanted with the mainstream parties because of what the mainstream parties have been doing.
Mhm.
And in the European systems, that shows up in fragmentation. And in the American system, it shows up in through the primary system, through attempted hostile takeovers of the parties through the primary system, or in Britain through what they call entryism. The Farage people threaten to, it's like a primary, they threaten to start supporting other candidates in candidate selection, if the Conservative Party doesn't support Brexit or
Mhm.
whatever they want. So becomes a functional equivalent. So the solution here is to start enact, we're back to the Wolf of the Door issues.
Mhm.
The mainstream parties need to get behind policies that are going to get most voters to think the system is working for them. And they don't. And the reason they don't is because it isn't. It's like not rocket science,
Mhm.
you know. And so that's the problem. And people who think it's the two-party system here, or people, they're just missing the donut for the whole. You can look at every one of these multi-party systems is in, is going through the same politics, whether it's, Germany or the Netherlands. The far right party just toppled the Netherlands government.
Right.
France, it's, the National Rally in France is now the most popular party. Austria, in Italy, they're in government now. Portugal, the far right party it's called Chega, has just, exploded onto the scene. Even in, even in the Nordic countries, you see this in Sweden, and so on and so forth. A couple of exceptions in Spain. The socialists are still winning. I've got a story I could tell you about Spain, but probably take too long. So I think it's unusual. Some unusual factors in Spain, but for the most part, it's not yeah, I'm a political scientist. I think political the right political reforms are important. But I think, the fact that this is happening in two-party systems and in multi-party systems and in single-party dominant systems, it tells you that there's something going on in these countries that is bigger than the electoral systems. And I think that's what it is.
Right. And just our final question before our fun question. Just building on what you were saying. I guess just in many democracies today, a lot of marginalized groups remain underrepresented, even when they hold full voting rights. And you've noted that reforms such as referendums and things like PR, proportional representation, even though they are introduced, I guess, in the name of democracy, like historically and in many cases, they have often ended up weakening democracy instead, as you said, through like fragmentation and things along those lines. Since we know that you've argued against these reforms, our question is just like more generally, like how do you see like marginalized groups can get a more formal democratic pathway to address this gap and ensure their voices are meaningfully included?
Well, there are reforms that would increase so-called descriptive representation that don't have these perverse side effects of
Yeah.
weakening and so forth. So, in a PR system, for instance, you can just have a rule which says, every other person needs to be a woman on the list.
Right.
Um, and in a single member district system, actually in India, they had something called Pune Pact, introduced in I think it was 1932 or some, yeah, maybe 1934, maybe, I don't know. But they said they picked out, I think it was 143 constituencies in which the only only untouchables could run.
Mm.
Okay. And I think New Zealand has a version of this for Maoris. So this is a way in which you can increase descriptive representation without distorting your whole electoral map,
Mm.
right? So there are creative ways to think about if that's an important goal for you. There are creative ways to think about it that wouldn't have the perverse effect in the case of majority minority districts of creating even more safe seats.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly the wrong way to go.
Yeah.
So I think electoral engineering is another whole fascinating world. But there's more than one way to do these things. And I think the biggest mistake people make is they get one idea in their head, like primaries. Oh, it's going to give voters more say. But they don't think about, well, which voters are going to get more say. They don't
Mm.
think about the knock-on effects for the system as a whole. And you really shouldn't get behind a reform without thinking through what the knock-on effects are going to be for the system as a whole, because you might get, for instance, PR is more representative at the electoral stage. The Greens get their people in parliament, and the old Marxists get their people in parliament, and the social democrats people get their in parliament, and the Christian Democrats get their people, and the libertarians get their people, and the Basque separatists get their people. So you get more representation in the parliament at the electoral stage, but do you get more representation in governments? Not necessarily,
Mm.
because it could be, a tiny party that can topple any government that can then extract huge rents for not toppling the government. If you get, the only coalition you can put together is between the far left and the far right that don't agree on anything. This is what Macron is running into now. You've got the far left and the right-wing populists have just toppled his government, but they don't agree on anything. They can't form a government. So, you get the country becomes ungovernable and people get angry and alienated and they say the system's not working. And, then the next step is, so what you need is a really strong executive to break, and so then you're off to the races. So it's very important in thinking about reforms, and that's what our Responsible Parties book is about. You've got to think about the electoral system in the context of, what is it you want to produce? Do you want to produce governments that are going to be responsive to the whole electorate? Or do you just want to have the Greens want to have their green people in parliament
Mm.
uh, and feel better represented because they've got their people there, even if they're not in the government?
Yeah, wow. Just definitely thinking about the domino effects that occur when trying to implement reforms that may seem great on paper is something that more of us should definitely consider. And now for the final and fun question. We always
Feeding.
like to leave the hardest question at the very end. We know you're one of the most respected and leading professors of our current generation and of our world today. So our question is, what has been the most surprising or memorable thing that's ever happened to you while teaching?
While teaching.
Yeah.
Um, well, I'm lucky to teach in a place where there are unbelievably good students. And so I think it's, when maybe you've been teaching something for 20 years and I can't think of an example right now, but
Yeah,
it
no worries.
happens where a student says something and you think, I've been teaching this for 20 years. I thought there was no questions somebody could ask or no comment they could make that I haven't thought of. And it turns out you were wrong. A student brings up something and you realize, wow, I've been teaching this for 20 years and I never thought of that. So it's humbling, and it's also invigorating because it's one of the few jobs where every year there's a new cohort of smart, young, curious, interesting people who just want to understand the world and are voraciously interested in learning. And you know, it's the best job in the world for that reason.
Well, thank you for that. That's super fascinating. Cool. Again, I think that concludes our interview today. Again, just from the
Okay.
bottom of our hearts, Jay and I would like to extend the biggest thank you possible to Professor Shapiro for this wonderful, wonderful opportunity and taking the time out of his insanely busy schedule to come here and speak with us today. We truly appreciate it. For all the listeners at home, if you guys wish to see more interviews like this, be sure to tune into future episodes. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time.